There was a research a while ago that said that there's a lot of 60s and 70-year-old folks that are spending a lot of over 8 hours a day on VR. Retired, typically living in a retirement home, that are spending a lot of time on VR because that's the only thing that they can do. And it's actually very fulfilling for them because it brings back this feeling of being free and being able to explore and all of these things. So it makes a lot of sense. Personally, I think that silver economy by itself is it's this whole thing that most companies are not actively exploring. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there, especially within China. You're going to find out that there's a lot of things happening in China for older people, right? Because they have realized that there's a lot of old people that want to consume technology and want to consume products, right? So, and there's a lot of trends going around in China, especially in their TikTok, which is not called TikTok, right? It's called Douyin, if I'm not mistaken. These older audiences, they want to consume things as well. So I think people from the rest of the world are naturally going to start realizing that, yes, there's a demand for these guys, right? And if you look at the progression of the birth rates and death rates and the progression of age throughout society, you're going to realize that in the near future there's going to be a lot more older people than younger people. So definitely an opportunity there.
Welcome back to another episode of MetaRick, where we talk about emerging technologies like XR and the Metaverse, the blockchain, artificial intelligence, meeting with creatives, technologists, and talking through this stuff from a business perspective. Today we've got Ely Santos. Ely Santos is someone I've been following on LinkedIn for a while now. I've heard him talk with automotive brands like Skoda about the Skodaverse and kind of cut through a lot of the BS and into more of the pragmatic kind of thinking around these technologies. He's the founder of Augmentric, which works as a sales as a service provider for B2B companies. And he's also the founder and host of the Metavertising podcast, which is killing it, by the way, on Spotify. I think you're one of the top 5% most shared podcasts worldwide and one of the top 15% most followed podcasts worldwide on Spotify. So congrats on all the traction. I know you've been working hard on that, and that was a big rebrand for your content a while back. So Ely, thanks for being here, and I'll kick it over to you to just kind of share a little bit about what you're working on today. Talk us through kind of your goals with Augmentric and Metavertising.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone that is listening to us today. I really appreciate you. And yeah, I think it's, the way that I can describe the things that have been happening, especially in the last few months, and also the things that I want to do in the next few months, I think it's kind of like a roller coaster because, it ends up being so dynamic, right? And I don't know, I think it's just the nature of the business, right? I think, working with AR, VR, Metaverse, and also being a founder, I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur, by the way, so being able to do this on a daily basis, it's like a dream come true to me. So, and obviously there's still a lot more to accomplish, but, it's a wild ride, In the last few years, I've been focusing a lot on Augmentric, where we do B2B sales as a service for software companies. We helped a lot of clients from the United States and Europe, clients worldwide, but mostly US and Europe. And that was my focus until 2021, until I started researching about what was going to be the next big trend in terms of marketing, right? So I'm a firm believer. When I came across around 2020 or maybe 2019, when I came across, the Alexa devices, the Echo Dot and all of these things, I was like, yes, this is really, really cool. And this is what's trending right now. A lot of people were buying these devices, especially here in Brazil. And there was a lot of interest about this, but I was like, all right, so what's the next big trend for marketers, right? What's the next big trend in terms of technology? And then naturally I started researching and came across augmented reality, right? And that was 2019, 2020. And so I was already doing a lot of research, and I was very interested about this field, but like it was very, I wouldn't say it was in its early stage or maybe its infancy, because it wasn't. Like AR and VR have been around for years now, for many, many years. And you know, like, but there was even though it was not at the beginning, there was not many content about it, and it was like it also felt that it was the beginning, right? Because you know, a lot of experimentation, and you know, just a lot of people trying to come up with useful applications for it. You know, even the smartphones at the time didn't have, like, they had the technology for AR, but it wasn't quite there just yet. So you know, it felt like it was very early. So mid 2021, you know, when Mark Zuckerberg said that he was going to rebrand the company and name Facebook Meta, so all the attention naturally came to Metaverse, and you know, like there was already this, you know, movement about, you know, brands creating their NFT collections, and you know, Web3, people were talking about it. So when he did that, it was the perfect timing for people to shift their attention towards Metaverse. So that's when I felt it was the right time for me to start creating content myself as well, because at the end of the day, what I wanted to do is just document my journey, right? So I wanted people to just basically register whatever I was working on, the conversations I was having, you know, the data that I was studying, the stuff that I was finding out about the space, right? And that's how the Metavertising podcast was born, right? I started just basically interviewing people that knew more than me about the topic, and I was genuinely asking questions about things that I wanted to know about the space. And at the same time, like back at the time, I was already creating content on LinkedIn, right? And then I've just basically shifted my content towards Metaverse and started talking about that. And whatever I was finding out was basically what I was posting about, right? And then eventually, like, you know, people started becoming interested about what I had to say, right? Especially in the podcast, which was, it was a huge surprise to me. I'm not going to lie. Like, I don't like bragging about, you know, numbers and saying that, you know, the Metavertising podcast is this or that. Like, I was surprised when Spotify got in touch with me and, you know, basically notified me that the podcast was being listened in such a large scale, and I was very surprised. So my goal initially was to document the journey, but then naturally, because of all of these things that I was learning and all of these things that I was exploring, companies started reaching out as well, asking for services, asking for consulting. And then naturally, I started transitioning towards that, right? And that's what we do today. We provide, like, we create AR and VR experiences for marketing purposes, right? But it was kind of like a natural transition. As I said, obviously, there's so much more that I personally want to accomplish with that, because I'm passionate about the field. In fact, when ChatGPT came up, and you know, like, there was the AI boom that still seems to last until this day, I haven't shifted areas. So I'm still focusing on Metaverse, I'm still focusing on AR, VR. But a lot of people shifted towards AI, which I completely understand because it's such an interesting field, right? But I want to continue pursuing AR, VR because I believe there's so much potential with that technology, right? And I think that's one of the things that we're here to talk about today, right?
Totally. No, awesome background on kind of what sparked the journey, and what you're talking about. I think there's a lot of parallels with some of the greatest creators that I love to follow. Is like, it always starts as just this curiosity, this interest in a topic, and then just as you dive into learning about it, you're documenting it, you're sharing it. Other people that want to learn about it benefit from that, and but like, I hate the word expert, but before you know it, you're pretty knowledgeable, and the insights that you have are really valuable for an audience, and you start to gather a community around you that starts to see you as a source of knowledge, a source of information, and that's an impactful thing. Like, when Spotify reached out to you to let you know, like, it's reached that point, like, what did that feel like? As that, did you feel affirmed? Was it a responsibility, or like, what was kind of your reaction when you heard that from Spotify?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the fact that I'm one of the trusted creators that you follow. I really appreciate that, man. But like, when Spotify reached out, it was a mix of feelings, because I think, you know, this huge part of me, like this imposter syndrome, kind of kicked in like kind of like, oh, this couldn't be, this can't be true. Like it was probably, they probably reached out to the wrong person, you know. So I think there was this big part of me, this imposter syndrome part that kicked in and like, no, this cannot be true. Which it's funny because, you know, I love researching and studying the lives of like founders that I really admire. One of them is Twitch's founder, Justin Kan, right? Which is also very active. He creates a lot of content, and I look up to him, especially because I use Twitch, right? I like using Twitch, and I remember him saying during one of the interviews that he has available on his channel that when he sold Twitch, it was like the moment of his life where his imposter syndrome like kicked in big time, like never before, which is extremely interesting and weird, right? Because Twitch was sold for over $1 billion for Amazon, right? And he's a very wealthy person now, and so you know, even a guy like Justin Kan, he has imposter syndrome, right? So
Sorry to cut you off, but that's a huge thing. This idea of imposter syndrome comes up with almost every person I've met who reaches a level of success. It's like, it's kind of proof that you're not a narcissist, right? It's like, but there's that moment that like you reach a certain level of success and the reaction, there's gratitude to it, but it's almost like this reverse reaction where you start to question whether it's deserving or whether you've actually made it to that point. Because to you still feel like you're just a curious guy that's leaning into trying to learn about this. Like you haven't lost that spark of wanting to learn. I imagine that feeling has to come up a little bit on the other side of it, not just with Spotify reaching out, but when people start asking you for consulting work or for you to come in and start actually working on these activations. What was that process like to move from an explorer that's just looking to learn about things to a provider, to someone who's actually executing on these things or helping enable these teams?
That's a great question. I think imposter syndrome, at the end of the day, it's natural, right? I think it's this, part of being human thing, right? And I think up to a certain extent, it could be considered a good thing because you're always challenging yourself to do more, right? And I think in this sense, I think it can be a good thing. But I also think that true growth comes with maturity, right? Of like being confident about who you are, also being humble, right? Like understanding that you don't know everything, so there's still things that you need to learn and there's still things that you need to explore. But also like being confident, right? And I think this type of confidence, it's something that you gradually work within yourself, right? So I think that's the challenge. It's like it's building this confidence of understanding, like, day by day, that like, all right, I'm getting there. People are recognizing it. I don't feel like I've gotten there yet, but like I certainly feel that I've done certain things that are, considered pretty, interesting, pretty great, and also worth celebrating and worth acknowledging, right? So I think I don't consider myself an expert. I don't consider myself an authority in the space. I think there are people that have a much more deep and technical knowledge about these areas that I talk about. But something that I do have, and I like to recognize in myself, is that I have a genuine interest about this area. And I'm willing to study, and I'm willing to do research, and I'm never content, and I never feel like I've researched enough, And that's not because I don't believe in myself, or maybe because I believe that I should learn more, but it's because I'm still curious, I'm still actively pursuing and willing to learn more about it. And I think this puts me in a position of being one page ahead in the same book of everyone else, that is also researching about this space. Of like, the same people that are very knowledgeable as well, I might be one page ahead in the same book, and I'm willing to share what's in this page ahead for them, and I think that's how I see it, like, and this puts me in a position of like still being humble and having to be humble enough to understand that I still have to learn, but also at the same time recognizing that I've spent a fair amount of time in the space doing research and doing a lot of stuff myself, just for the sake of it, and I'm willing to share that, I'm willing to share that with whoever wants to listen to it.
Yeah, I think the words that I've tried to replace expert with is active participant, because I think that's what it comes down to is, are you actively participating in this journey? Some people have been on the journey for a long time. That surprised me, that there's people like going to AWE about a month ago. There's folks that have been building in this space for the last 20 years. There's folks that have been through all of the bear markets and bull markets and ups and downs and the technology just not being ready yet. And like this idea of taking gaming technology for business is not totally new. A few episodes ago, I interviewed this guy, Rolf, from Germany, and he used to work at Sony, and they were playing around with how to use the PS2 for healthcare use cases back when the PS2 was the game system, right? It's kind of crazy to think about that, but that's something that's been a part of the experiment for a while now. And so we're all just in different phases of the journey, on both sides as advisors and vendors, but also as buyers. Everybody's kind of in a different place. Some folks have worn a VR headset a bunch and maybe spend an hour or two in there every day. Other people still haven't even tried one, still haven't worn one before. And so I think it's a lot of kind of recognizing where we are on the journey and then trying to figure out kind of where the people that we're talking to are on that journey, and give them the advice that's most helpful, ask the questions that can help us level up. The thing that's really been interesting to me about the metaverse, but also Web3 and like all of these kind of technologies, community is such a big piece of it. As marketers using it, it's a way to engage with community and build community in a more authentic way and in a more engaging way. But I found when I first started kind of trying to really double down on this stuff, I was spending hours every day in Discord and Twitter Spaces, on LinkedIn, just DMing people, trying to ask them questions. And I found people were very, very supportive of newcomers and kind of zooming out and being like, this is what the blockchain actually is. This is what it does. These are the tools in our stack when we go out to build a 3D world. These are the types of people that we work with. Like, people would really zoom out and kind of help give me that insight. And within 3 months, you start to feel like you're really knowledgeable. Like within 4, 5, 6 months, you start to feel like you really know a lot. But it all comes from the fact that people were willing to pass that information around a little bit. I wonder if there was a community or a particular person when you kind of started leaning into this that was almost like a mentor or a really great source of information for you when you first started.
Yeah, definitely. I remember when I started studying about the space, Clubhouse was a big thing, right? So Clubhouse had just come up, and I was lucky enough to get one of the first, being one of the first few people in there. I was able to get one of those, because back then you needed invitations in order to get into Clubhouse, right? So I was able to get an invitation from a friend, and I got into Clubhouse, and surprisingly there was this Metaverse discussion room that would happen once a week, and it was organized by Teddy Pahagbia, right? Which he calls himself Mr. Metaverse, right? And it was organized by him. And I was lucky enough to get in touch with him and other people that were participating of his Clubhouse room back at the time. And so I remember I would just get a lot of information just by listening to the Clubhouse sessions and just talking to him. But also, I think
hold on. Let's dive into who that is a little bit. I might be totally ignorant and showing some ignorance here, but for me, but also the listener, tell us a little bit more about it. Was it Teddy who?
It's Teddy Pahagbia, and he's very active. He's not very active on LinkedIn, but he posts every once in a while. So basically, even before Mark Zuckerberg started talking about the metaverse, he was already creating some content about metaverse, right? And also interviewing some people on Clubhouse. And so nowadays, he owns a consulting firm that is focused on helping brands to explore the metaverse and I'm not exactly sure like how he does that, like what exactly he does when it comes to consulting. But I understand that it has a lot to do with like the technology that is used in order for brands to explore the metaverse or Web3 in general, right? And he's actually like, he's not a major, I wouldn't say he's a major name in the space right now, because a lot has happened ever since he started his Clubhouse sessions. But I do know he's very knowledgeable about the topic, right? And he has worked with a lot of big brands about, you know, doing metaverse strategy, like LVMH, for example. And so a lot of big brands and a lot of also like big names in the space. He has worked with them as well, like Kathy Hackle, like Matthew Ball, all of the big names. He has worked with those guys. So he's very knowledgeable. So he kind of like, I wouldn't say he introduced me to the space, but like I would get information from him that was hard to get anywhere else, right? So I guess that was one of the sources. But then I would say another major source for me was just basically reading studies that were coming out from big consulting firms like Accenture, KPMG, you know, BCG. Like back then there were a lot of, and there still are, right? Like there's still a lot of these documents coming out with data, with research, and you know, like whatever they are finding out about the metaverse. And so back at the time, there were a lot of those coming out, right? And a lot of those consulting companies were releasing these documents, and I'm not sure if many people were actually taking the time to read it, but I was. Like I literally, I would download each and every one of those like documents and just basically sit through them, right? I would, back at the time, ChatGPT didn't exist yet, so you couldn't just, you know, like paste the content on ChatGPT and ask it to summarize it.
That's
nowadays,
smart.
Nowadays
I like
I do
that.
that. No, nowadays I do that. It saves a lot of time. But back at the time, you couldn't do that, right? So I would just read them, and the insights in those documents is just mind blowing. And then when I started doing the podcast, I realized that throughout the conversations that I had with the guests, even though they were experts in their own like fields of expertise, I had some alpha and some information that they didn't have, just because I was reading those documents, right? And you can rely on the information that you can find in those documents, because these companies, they have very, very smart people coming up with the research behind, you know, the data that you see in those documents, right? They have very, very smart teams actively trying to figure out what is the next step, and like what is the data that they should be providing to other companies and to the people that are reading to these documents, right? So it's very rich and very useful information, and I was reading through all of those, right? And this allowed me to have a unique perspective about what was happening in the space. And I've started to realize that when, you know, especially in the podcast and also through my posts, right, the stuff that I was sharing, nobody else had the same vision, right? So I think that was like, I would attribute those two things to like having the perspective that I have today. But I would attribute, like, I would say out of these two, I would attribute the biggest importance to the documents that I was reading, right? Because nobody, I'm pretty sure nobody else reads these, right? Because it's very, very, it's boring to read these, right? It's packed with numbers, and it's, like some of them have like over 200 pages, right? And so nobody wants to read these, but I was, you know, so.
I just want to emphasize it, because I was that guy reading those documents too. And like the Accenture reports specifically, I think they kind of paved the path on kind of leading the way on it. They're doing a great job of kind of being a leader. But Boston Consulting Group and KPMG and Deloitte, like McKinsey, all of these consulting firms, this is what their job is. This is why they get paid so much money, is to be as knowledgeable as possible on all of this stuff and start building teams out for it before the brands can take it in-house, because the brands need it to be more figured out before they can start investing and building their own fully robust XR teams and metaverse teams. Like they might have a metaverse officer, they might have a few senior leaders to define their strategy around it, but they need consulting firms that can spend all their time on this across multiple verticals and master it, to help them define that strategy and then to implement these teams of actual Unreal developers and Unity developers and There's also a variety of smaller kind of niche agencies that specialize like in Roblox specifically, like in particular platforms. But I totally agree. I think those reports are underread. A lot of people read the thumbnail or like the high-end summary and then don't dive into the weeds of it. I wonder if in your process of reading through those reports, was there anything that really like surprised you that these consulting firms found out that you that might have not been intuitive as someone who hasn't read those reports?
No, I don't really think so. Like what I felt when I was reading the reports was like that it was the same thing that I was saying just now. Like I felt that they were like one page ahead in the same book, right? That's what I felt. Like I felt that like we were all like uncovering what the future was going to look like together, kind of. And whenever I was reading through the documents, I was like, oh, all right, this makes a lot of sense. Like I can definitely see this happening. And I can definitely see this trend that they're mentioning here. I can definitely see, the vision that they have, So it felt like they were one, maybe 2 pages ahead in the same book. And that they were like, that we were all like in the forest, and just nobody could see anything that was happening. Like it was nighttime. And they were kind of like, they had a flashlight and they were kind of like cutting through the woods, with like one of these big knives, like cutting through the woods with a flashlight and like, this is the way, guys, come with me. That's what I felt when I was reading those reports. But that by itself helps a lot, like maybe I made it sound like it wasn't very helpful, but it actually was, because back at the time, like as you said, and still to this day, a lot of people haven't tried VR. A lot of people haven't tried AR. A lot of people don't even know the difference between AR and VR. A lot of people have no idea what it means, So I think back at the time, especially 2 years ago in 2021, it was even worse. So having these reports of people that understood more than we did about the topic, and there were some actual experts, like within these researchers, like people that actually knew what they were talking about, helped us make sense of whatever was happening and have a unique vision about the future that most people didn't have.
Totally. And I think the other big thing these consulting firms do, and there's like a joke, right, of no one ever gets fired for hiring McKinsey to come in and give you your corporate strategy, right? So they de-risk a lot of things, which is big, because they have that credibility of being able to put in the man hours to gather the data and kind of give more meat to the argument. Instead of it being a feeling that this is right, they can really show you that it's right. And I think there's a power in that. And as someone who's curious about the space, like yourself, that was leaning in and like, I need to read all this information, they help affirm a lot of those feelings. They help give you more kind of tools in your arsenal to kind of equip you when you're talking about it, to be like, no, I can think through this topic 3 layers deeper than I could before I read that. Like you might have understood the point at a high level, but now you can fully understand why it matters so much and kind of why there's value in it. With the podcast, so you obviously having these conversations is a great source of information for you too. And do you mostly focus on big corporate marketers or early stage startup founders, or what type of people do you tend to bring on, and how do you find them?
That's a good question. I don't actually have like an actual process, because I've been in some podcasts where like things are so tightly organized that they have like a very strict process in order to find people to interview in their podcasts. Mine is just kind of a gut feeling, like as I'm browsing through LinkedIn and as I'm exploring social media in general, and I come across some people that from the first interaction that I have with them, I can see that they have a different vision than most other people that I have come across in the space, right? So I start reading through their stuff and it makes a lot of sense. Or maybe sometimes, which doesn't happen very often, but like, sometimes people comment on my stuff or maybe send me a message, and then I can, from their first messages, I can clearly see they know something that most people don't understand, right? And so based on like this interaction, I start trying to make sense of like, all right, so what is the information that they have that I don't have, and why, And so sometimes it comes from like this huge authority, right? So recently I have interviewed the president of HTC in my podcast. And so I was expecting a lot of alpha, like a lot of insights nobody else has. And he actually delivered, like he came with information that it was very, like a lot of very interesting data, a lot of research that HTC has done, a lot of stuff that they know that most other companies, even consulting companies, are not aware of, right? And so it was extremely interesting. And so sometimes that's the case, like it's this huge authority that is willing to come into the podcast when I invite them. And sometimes like I just invite, like it could be a marketer from a big brand, it could be a marketer from a startup, it could be a founder. I just realize that they have insights that most other people don't have, right? One way or the other. And so I start, talking to them, and I start kind of like investigating. And then as it turns out, they do have something, to offer. And like kind of my rule with the podcast is like trying to provide as much value as possible and not offering like, or maybe asking anything in return, like I don't do like call to actions for you to buy their products, or use their products. It's just basically like, let's talk about what's behind your product, right? What is the technology? What made you, like, what was the insight that made you pursue a product in this area, right? In this industry. So that's what I try to share, the value behind whatever they're building. And typically, like, the insights are so rich that I learn a lot from each conversation, right? Or maybe sometimes I don't learn a lot, but I learn a few things that make all of the difference, right? So, yeah.
With these, so obviously some high-profile guests coming on, right, that have that unique insight. At AWE, those folks were everywhere. It was funny because there's a lot of people that I maybe have met on a Zoom call similar to these kind of like just random LinkedIn connections of like, hey, let's chat. Maybe 2 years ago, we had a 30-minute call, and then we'd be in line at coffee at AWE and we'd look at each other's name tags and I'd be like, wait, we've met. Like we've been in this industry for a minute. It was so cool. I think that as much as we love the engagement of 3D virtual worlds, that in-person connection still has a place. There's something special about it. But with these high-profile people, they also have there's some sensitivity around some information that they have, right? Like when you're making really big corporate decisions, and especially around emerging new technologies. I say that so much it starts to sound like a buzzy, like a buzzword. But the idea that it's new means that there's more risk associated with it. It's more experimental. So sometimes I find folks are really open when they're working with you on something, but maybe can't be as open publicly about sharing everything. Like customer stories that this industry tends to be a little tighter on. Have you found any topics or certain types of questions that people are more hesitant to answer, or that it's harder to find that information?
Yeah, kind of. It depends on who you're talking to, right? So, for example, like I've had a situation where I've spoken to a very high-profile consultant in the podcast, and she wasn't able, like I asked some questions, and they were just like general questions. It wasn't like a sensitive topic about certain companies, because these companies were very relevant to the space. So just for the sake of the argument, let's say Meta, right? So I asked some questions about their vision about Meta and this and that, and they were not able to share their actual perspective about the topic because they are under a big contract with this company, right? So I think it depends on who you're talking to, but typically, like, they are I think they're pretty open with like signaling you of the fact that they cannot express their opinion about certain topics, right? For example, like I've had at this point like 2 episodes, I think, where I talked about the Chinese Metaverse, right? And the Chinese Metaverse is like, it's a topic that I'm very, very interested about, because over the years, I was given the understanding that they are very far ahead of the rest of the world when it comes to the Metaverse, right? Especially, AR, VR, all the technologies involved, NFTs. So they're very far ahead in the game. But it's a country where you have to be very respectful regarding certain topics, right? And these guests that I have talked about the Chinese metaverse too, there were certain things that they weren't able to reply because they are Chinese citizens, right? So so it really depends, I guess. It depends on the topic, it depends on who you're talking to, but generally they're okay with like telling you that they are not able to share more information about that, and I think that's okay, you know, like I'm not in the position, and I don't want to be in the position of being pushy about these things, right? I just, as I said, the goal is to provide value, so you know, for the guests to be able to provide value, they have to be comfortable, right? So I don't want to do something that is going to make them uncomfortable.
Yeah, there's always a balancing act, right? And it's like you want to get as much information and provide as much value to the listener as you can, but at the same time, you got to be respectful of what insight can be shared in the first place. When it comes to, because I think a lot of folks that are just dipping their toe into the water of this space, like some of the questions that they might have before they even get started might be around, do I need $250,000 budget to do something like that? Like if I did get $250,000 or $500,000 or $1 million, what could I get for that? I think that's tends to be a big blocker that people get hung up on. Do you find that it's been pretty easy to kind of identify like what do people spend to get certain results, or is that something that's a little more buttoned up?
So I think something that I've said in a lot of my posts, in a lot of my content in general, you know, in the lives that I do, in the podcast, is before you have an approved budget, you know, to do an experience, whatever that is, you know, just make sure that you have a very, and I wouldn't say just make sure, you know, like I would say that's essential, you know, like just take a step back and, you know, have a very strong reason why. You know, why do you want to do this? And that's something that I felt a lot, you know, ever since I started in the space and I've started doing research and I've started studying use cases from big brands. Like, it doesn't seem like a lot of people have a strong reason why they're doing it. It's, you know, most of the times I felt it was either FOMO or it was just maybe trying to surf the hype, you know, like, let's just do it because everyone else is doing it. That's the hot topic right now. Let's just do it, you know. And that's an awful reason for you to jump into the space, right? Because at the end of the day, you know, if you're doing an activation for marketing purposes, you want to have at least some, you know, indications that you're going to have a return on your investment, right? And that's not always the case, you know. Like, so for example, if you take a look at branded activations, you know, branding purposes, you know, you don't have an actual ROI. It's not easy for you to measure, but you know that over time, customers are going to choose your brand over the other brands, right? So it's not necessarily measurable. So you, in certain cases, you shouldn't expect to be able to measure your return on certain activation, but you should have at least some indication that what you did was successful. And you're only able to do that if you have a reason why you're going to be doing this activation in the first place, right? Else, how can you measure success if you don't know what success looks like, right? So I think that's the biggest thing, you know. It's not the budget, you know, because you know, for example, we've done projects for less than $10,000 for very small companies just because they believed it was a good reason for them to jump into the space. And they just required like very small activations, just very simple stuff, and we were able to do it for less than 10K. And but before actually doing that and actually, you know, moving forward with the project, we sat down and said, all right, look, why do you want to do this? Like, what is the reason why you decided this is going to be a good idea for your business? And then trying to make reason out of that, right? In order to see what success looks like. And then based on that, you know, having the strong reason why, and then having also, like, you know, looking at the marketing fundamentals of looking like, what is the target audience that you want to reach out to, right? What is your offer? What is your product? Why, what you're offering, why is it different from, you know, whatever else is on the market right now? And why this channel, you know? And so asking these kind of fundamental reasons why, you know, like asking these fundamental questions helped us drive the project. And then we would talk about budget, right? And then we would talk about, all right, so what is the budget that we need to approve for this, right? And as it turns out, many of the times it was actually a lot cheaper than they would had in mind, just because they wanted to jump into Roblox because everyone else was doing it. But then they realized it wouldn't make any sense for them to jump into Roblox, right? So I think that's the thing, it is a little bit of budget, yes. It doesn't have to be expensive, obviously. It could be a lot more affordable. But the way for you to find out if it's going to be affordable or not, or maybe even decreasing the price, the estimated price of your project, is having it very airtight, like exactly what you want to do and why, And so, yeah.
So there's a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, I think there's a good reminder in there that you don't need $250,000 to try this stuff, especially like with existing platforms like Roblox that have so many pre-built things that you can just play with, that you can, for a few grand, run experiments. And there's a lot of VR platforms that are like, $50 a month to get a full enterprise experience of collaboration and jumping in. Even basic things like Meta Workrooms. I know it's easy to hate on Meta, and a lot of people give them a lot of flack, but I've used to work with Engage XR. I've tried every single platform, Arthur, Glue, every spatial, all the ones you could think of, right? And Meta Workrooms is one of the best when it comes to basic remote collaboration, whiteboarding sessions, crystal clear, crisp screen sharing. Like, they have some basic stuff that they've really done well. The billions of dollars they're spending has created a good product, and it's free. So if people are just trying to try things, I think there's cost-effective ways to experiment. I wonder, because you've obviously touched a wide spectrum of all of these things, right? And you've also probably talked to a lot of brands who are trying to figure out how to get started. Before deciding what that why is, it can be hard to come up with a business case without understanding what your options are. I think sometimes people just get overwhelmed with XR, and it's like metaverse, augmented reality. There's so many things. Blockchain. Do I need a blockchain involved? Like, it's tough to realize a business case when you're so overwhelmed by new terms and new technologies. What would be your recommendation for someone at the very beginning of that journey that's trying to identify where to start? Like, how would you recommend they kind of start experimenting, start learning about this stuff?
That's a good question. I think, we're in a much different stage than we were like 2 years ago, right? When Mark Zuckerberg changed the company name from Facebook to Meta, right? Back then, there were a lot of people that didn't really know what it was, but they wanted to jump in, right? There wasn't much content about it. Like, it was a different space. Now I think, I wouldn't say everyone, but like a lot of people are a lot more educated than they used to be, especially because they've done projects in the space, so they know what they're talking about. They've had these experiences. So I think it's a different space now. So I think, there's a lot more content. There's a lot more knowledgeable people about the topic. So I would say, first and foremost, do your homework, right? Study about the space, see what are the technologies, or maybe what are the metaverse platforms that exist out there right now, and why one is different from the other, right? So if you want to explore metaverse platforms, or if you want to explore VR, most of them are free. You could do it for free, as you said. There's a lot of interesting apps that you can, use for free. You don't need sometimes you would need a device. In, like you mentioned, Meta Workrooms, like you just need a VR device, right, in order to explore it. So I would say just do your homework. There's a lot of content about it, and as you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, Metaverse is still a relatively broad term, so it means a lot of things at the end of the day because there's no official definition, and so we could be talking about AR, we could be talking about VR, XR, we could be talking about something a little different than that. So if you look at Fortnite, for example, Fortnite is not VR, Fortnite is not AR, but some people consider it a metaverse, kind of like a metaverse-like platform, and that's okay, because there's no official definition. And so, and there's a lot of brands in there as well doing activations there, especially in the creative mode. So, and Fortnite is free, and odds are your computer runs it, or maybe you have a PlayStation that runs it, And so, a lot of these things are free, and there's a lot of content about it. It means a lot of things. So I think, just basically do your homework, understand exactly, what do you have in mind when you say metaverse? Like, try to define that, and then follow that direction in order to figure out what you need to do in order to, follow that direction, and just basically position yourself in that space. Or maybe, like, as you're finding out, you're gonna see what exactly piques your interest, and then just follow that, right? And at the end of the day, since most of the stuff is free, you don't have to worry about spending money in order to learn it, right? Much different from what the NFT market used to be, right? You needed to purchase an NFT in order to learn what an NFT was, right? You were basically investing into education. In this case, you don't have to invest as much. You can buy a device, odds are your smartphone also runs AR, so you wouldn't need to spend additional money on top of that in order to learn what AR is. So, just as I said, there's a lot of content. Just do your homework. And if you need to invest into something, buy a couple of devices, maybe an app subscription, and there you go.
Yeah, it's less of a monetary investment for a lot of these things. Like even a headset is not as expensive. Like, people talk about them being priced out and stuff, but it's like, if you're a big company, $500, like, it's not that much for what you get to experience. And I think a lot of people see it almost like an accessory, when in reality it's like, no, this opens a whole new door of things you can play around with. But even WebXR experiences, there's a ton of free things to try out just on your computer or on your mobile phone. I think the bigger investment comes down to a time investment to do the research and check these things out. And that's where, if you can afford it, hiring someone like Ely to come in and help talk you through it and kind of point you in a direction where it's like, try these 3 things instead of this endless list of things, could be really helpful. Getting an expert to come in, or someone who's more knowledgeable, has spent more time kind of already doing that research. If you have the time and you're interested and excited, jump right in, start diving into all this stuff. When you are dealing with brands and companies, is there a particular like pattern you found in like the buyer, like who the person is who owns metaverse activations, or the types of stakeholders involved in these campaigns? Like, what are what's the department or the type of titles? Like, who tends to be involved on the buy side?
It's typically marketing, right? Because the CEO hates these types of activations, right? Typically, especially in a big company, because the CEO wants to put their money where he knows it's going to be worth paying for, right? And the metaverse, as I said, like, depending on what you want to do, and that's also like, I would blame this kind of misconception on like a lot of CEOs and marketers that have jumped in just because it was hype, just because of FOMO. And so a lot of the CEOs believe that there's no ROI in the metaverse. And I've been saying this since 2021, and I still say that to this day. There's still a lot of people that believe there's no ROI in the metaverse, which is not true. There's a lot of very successful activations out there right now. So, the reason why there are activations that are not so great is because it typically comes from marketing, right? And so marketers, traditionally, they're often looking for whatever is the channel that is attracting people's attention at the moment, right? Which is one of the reasons why they jump into these things out of hype and out of FOMO, right? Because they know there's a lot of attention towards these things right now. But as it turns out, if you don't do it properly, it's not going to work, You're going to do a bet that people are going to jump into it just because everyone is paying attention to the space, and it's not going to work. So it comes out of marketing because, they want to invest into things where people are paying attention to. That's why brands partner with influencers. That's why, brands are running ads on Twitch. That's why, Facebook isn't as popular as it used to be, because there isn't as much people in there anymore, daily active users. So you have to figure out, what is the demographic they want to impact? What are the people that you're trying to impact? What are their age ranges, especially? Like, are they young girls, or are they adult men? I don't know. So it depends on who you're trying to impact. And then based on that, picking what is the channel that you want to invest into. So as it turns out, they learned that there's this new thing called Web3, there's this new thing called Metaverse, everyone's talking about it, there's a lot of attention there right now, so let's just do it, And then they somehow convinced the CEO that it's a good idea to do right now and end up losing money. Obviously, a lot of the big brands, they have the budget to afford these things and not having to worry about losing money, right? And I remember when Walmart did an activation on Roblox, and I remember they said, their CEO specifically said, I think it was in a tweet or maybe it was in the LinkedIn post that he did, he specifically said that they were okay with losing money by doing an activation on Roblox because they were just experimenting, right? At the end of the day...
I think you brought up a point earlier that kind of comes into play here too, is this idea of having a really strong business case and knowing what the reasons are for the activation. Because if your activation's just for PR, I do think that's okay. I hate when I forget who gave me insights, but on a previous episode of this podcast, someone said that to me, and because I always used to puffaw that idea that a metaverse activation just for PR is a waste of energy, waste of money. It's and most of the time I still think it is. Most of the time it's if you're not building for the space and to try and see where this goes in the long run, you're probably not going to get a great return. But if you know that's what it is, if you go into the project thinking this is for PR, this is a short-term activation for 1 week or for 1 weekend, that's totally okay. There's plenty of marketing exercises that are about that. But you need to be defining that at the beginning so that you set your KPIs and your expectations and you build the project around it being that short-term activation so that you can get that value. Versus if you're trying to build something for the long term, like I think Nike is a great example of this. When Nike first got into Roblox, I remember all my friends cracking jokes about it. In Discord, people did not think it was a fit. They thought it was this ridiculous idea. Zoom 2-3 years into the future, and Nike landed Roblox as one of the most visited areas of that entire platform, and it's incredibly successful. And now they're expanding that into Fortnite with an older demographic, and they're really doing things. But that wasn't necessarily looked at as a great approach at the beginning. But because their team saw the big picture and looked at it through a different lens, they were able to build it into something different. And so I think that it goes back to that point you brought up earlier of really understanding your business case and defining that. The other thing I'd be curious about is because there's a lot of activations, and we've kind of touched on this, that some of them are smoke and mirrors and kind of shouldn't have been activations. Some of them have gone well. What's an example of a brand you think is really doing a good job of these experiments? And not Nike, because I just said that one, but another brand that you think might be doing a good job of this sort of thing.
Oh, it's hard to point just one now, because now there are so many, right? If you asked me that a year ago, I would have from the top of my head 5 brands that I can mention on the spot, this one that are doing an amazing job. Now I think there's so many, right? And there's so many awful activations still, but there's so many amazing activations as well. I think in general, out of the recent ones that I've seen, I think H&M did an amazing job by combining virtual humans and kind of the concept of Metaverse with just regular Instagram ads, right? And they did an amazing job because they were targeting a specific demographic of young girls in the United States and Canada, that they were able to catch their attentions by using Metaverse as kind of a vehicle, right, to run their campaign. So at the end of the day, they were selling the same products, but they were doing it in a different way that spoke to their audience, right? And I think a lot of the fashion brands that appeal to younger women or maybe younger girls, they do an amazing job by exploring these metaverse platforms. I recall Forever 21 also did an amazing job with that because they got into Roblox and they created something that these girls actually enjoyed playing with, and they sold very simple skins for their avatars that, as it turns out, the kids, the young girls, were very interested about, So I think it's a matter of it takes back to the marketing fundamentals. And I'm sorry if I'm talking about the marketing fundamentals way too much and the reason why, but it's that simple, and I think, as I said, like H&M, Forever 21 did an amazing job. The other day I also saw the beauty brand that Rihanna has created. I think it's called Fenty. They also did an amazing job. I think they did an amazing job. I'm not sure.
There's something about so that was going to be my follow-up, because you mentioned how hard it is to kind of name one brand because there's so many kind of doing it well now. That space of luxury goods seems to really be hitting this strong. Like, even like automotive has been playing around with 3D a lot longer than most industries. Like automotive and medical have probably the most experience with 3D animation and modeling. But even in automotive, it's the luxury car brands like the Mercedes-Benz of the world that seem to be doing the best job. The Audis, like the Porsches, these companies. I know their NFT had a flop, but when it comes to 3D building, like they're still doing some very exciting work. The Alpines in Formula One, right? Like these luxury kind of glorious brands, Gucci, like L'Oreal, these brands you're talking about. And I think part of my hypothesis for why they're doing well is because there's this like personality and emotional attachment that's bigger than just a how does it work or like a visually just showing it. So there's more opportunity to integrate like a piece of your personality to your avatar in a game or to your character. Like this digital footprint of your digital identity starts to combine that emotional feeling to the brand. Is that kind of similar to what you or why do you think these luxury goods seem to be doing the best job of this?
Yeah, that's a great point. Definitely, the luxury brands are doing an amazing job at this, and some of the most successful cases belong to these either luxury brands or like a little, I would say, a little more affordable brands, but brands that have a huge brand recognition, like so Nike, Adidas, these big names in the fashion space, and so I agree with you, and I think a big reason why a lot of these luxury brands are getting into platforms like Roblox, it's because like if you look at the reason why someone would ever spend like 10 times more money on a luxury handbag rather than a regular handbag, or maybe a sneaker in a luxury sneaker, it's because of the brand, right? Like at the end of the day, like you want to be seen using something from that brand because there's a status attached to it, right? And I think as you like, and I think it varies from person to person, but I think as you grow older, like you kind of grow out of it, right? Like so for example, I'm gonna use myself as an example, even though it might not be the best example, but when I was a kid, like I had this perception of like not a kid, but like when I was younger, like I had this perception of like wearing clothing from a certain brand would make me look better versus wearing clothing from a brand that can't be recognized, right? And I kind of grew out of it. Like nowadays I like to wear stuff that doesn't have any brand name in it, but I think there's always going to be this perception of like, oh, this person is wearing this brand, hence like there's a status attached to it, right? If you look at third world countries, people choose iPhones over Android phones just because it's an Apple product, right? So there's a status attached to it. And there was a very interesting research that I've read a while back from BCG in partnership with High Snobiety. And High Snobiety is like this, I wouldn't call it community, but it's a company that actively invests. And I say invest, I don't mean like, puts money into, but I'd say like invest their time and effort into understanding luxury, right? And they talk a lot about luxury. They have a very popular Instagram profile where they only post about luxury brands, right, and their products. And so they did a study BCG did a study in partnership with High Snobiety where they have interviewed younger audiences. They have interviewed basically like all generations, but they focused on the younger audiences on understanding why they purchase from luxury brands, right? And there's always the matter of the status, but there's also like younger generations. They are looking also at sustainability and also like making sure that the stuff that they're buying it's not only luxury, it not only has a brand attached to it, but also like it has a responsibility behind it. So there's a lot of reasons, but it's hard for you to keep up with that popularity when these luxury brands are doing activations in channels that the newer generations are not looking at, right? So when I grew up, like it was common for our family to sit in front of the television, right, and just watch TV, right? I think that was common in most people from like younger millennials, which is my generation, maybe even one generation after that, and definitely generations before that. So it was common for you to watch TV with your family, or maybe watch TV by yourself, right? But nowadays it's not. They watch YouTube, they watch, they are playing on Roblox, they are playing on Fortnite, they are using different channels. So they understand that there are these brands called Chanel, Burberry, all of these luxury brands, Louis Vuitton, but they are not able to recognize it as much as we are, right? And so that's why they are jumping into these, like, creating Roblox skins, right? Because they want the younger people to be able to show off their luxury items just like an adult would, right? But in their own platforms and in their own way. So I think, there's this very, very strong reason why these brands are jumping into these platforms, because they want to plant a seed in the minds of the younger audiences to make them understand what luxury is and what those brands are, right? And keep the brand recognition alive, right? And yes, I agree with you. There's a lot of, there's this personality behind using this type of product, right? So yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of thoughts there. One, it's like, I think you're absolutely spot on about it's like influencing another kind of future generation where they spend their time, where they're socializing, where they're interacting. It's this new channel, like even brands sponsoring like the arena inside of 2K for like, or a Madden football stadium. Like, it's so simple. It's not right in your face. Like no one likes the mobile ads that take you away from the game for 30 seconds before you can play. But brands just being associated and living in the environment that your customers are spending their time. So they start to see you as the big brand that when they grow up and spend money, or when they ask their parents for things, like there's a big world there. Some of it is a little bit dark and scary, and some of it just makes sense. But I think there's the second factor, which is it's a new way of engaging with a customer. So it's not just a new location for where the customer is, but you're also giving a little bit more intimacy to that connection. Because when I'm playing a video game, for example, it's like I am this character that's interacting. I'm living the story. I'm a part of it. Versus when I'm watching TV and there's a commercial that cuts in between, it's like I'm just consuming something versus being it. And I think when you can turn your audience into an active participant of your story, into a part of that story, they attach themselves more to it. They take more ownership of it. And then you create these customers that start to evangelize your brand more.
That's a great, very, very good point. And that's something that I always say in my presentations and in my lectures, right? That's the big difference between marketing, like the old marketing and the new marketing, let's say, right? Because now you get to put your customer or your prospect in the center of a story. And they are they're actually the main character, right? Because before, advertising and marketing would just talk at you, right? So right now you're living through the story that a brand is telling you, right? And that's one of the reasons why it's so magical. So I completely, that's a great point they've raised there. I think that's why Metaverse marketing and advertising is so genius. And not many people seem to realize it, right? So imagine the value that a brand like Chanel has now that a young girl has been using one of their handbags on Roblox, or maybe one of their, one of their sweatshirts on Roblox. And like this kind of has a huge impact in their childhood, right? So I think a good parallel to that is, especially like when I look at my childhood, like McDonald's, right? So McDonald's they're kind of like, I wouldn't say they're losing their brand appeal, but back then in the 90s, I remember like going to McDonald's with my parents and asking for a Happy Meal, and it was so good. Like, it was this childhood moment, right? And that's exactly the reason why sometimes I still eat McDonald's, because it brings me back these memories, the flavor, like the feel. And that's the exact same thing that is happening with metaverse marketing right now, right? And brands that are impacting younger audiences, they're creating a memory in these young consumers' heads that is going to last forever. Every time that they look at a channel back, they're going to remember that once when they were a kid on Roblox, they were the same handbag, right, in their favorite virtual world. And that has a huge like emotional impact that you just can, it's like every marketer's dream to have this kind of impact in their consumers, right? But not every marketer can do it.
Well, and I think there's an opportunity where the younger generation starting to care more about corporate culture and the stories of these brands than they used to. And we're seeing that in entertainment, right? So like biopics like Air that just came out for Nike, or the Gucci story that came out a few years ago, or Lamborghini, movies like Rush talking about, or Ford versus Ferrari, like there's all of these movies that kind of highlight that. And then you're getting these TV shows like We Crashed, and there's the Uber one with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and there's the Spotify one on Netflix, which I thought was really well done. And so I think that the younger audience, like, we're starting to see the story of what it was like to found a company and to build it. And like, there's an excitement of being a part of that. So I think even in the workplace culture with internal communications, not just with how you engage with your customer, but how you engage your employees and recruit the next generation of talent, I think there's a way to start turning those stories from movies and shows into like AAA games and onboarding experiences. Like, have you seen the Spotify show that I mentioned? I love the way that they tell the story where each episode is from the perspective of a different character.
Right.
So you start to feel the same scene, the same interactions, but the tone changes when it's from the legal person's perspective versus the marketers. Like, they all remember it differently. Yeah. And I think that making a game version of that for your company's story and letting your new employees kind of live through those experiences inside of a mini game, what a cool way to just drive empathy for understanding all the different coworkers you interact with, for getting excited, taking more ownership over what the work you're about to be doing is. Like, there's this whole new opportunity for engagement.
And I think that's part of the challenge, right? Because at the end of the day, like, it sounds extremely cool, but when you actually implement it, there's a lot of like 30 and 40-year-olds that work for you that are going to hate the experience just because they are not native gamers, right? So I think that's the challenge that many brands have faced up until this point. Like, oh, let's do it because it's, it's immersive, it's amazing, everyone's going to love it. And
do you know the irony in that, which is so funny to me, is because I think you're right. Like, I think there's a lot of folks that are in that 30s to 40s and 50s that don't want to go through that kind of experience. But the funny thing is, they still have an alternative, which is like an old school LMS system that is like basically like the whole sexual harassment software. It's like you watch a video and then you click next and then you answer 2 questions and then watch another video, and it's this super boring, unengaging. It doesn't get you excited. But I think you're right, for that generation of people, because they're familiar with it, it's easier for them to click through the boring process. And then it's really for that next generation of like new fresh college grads, people in their 20s, maybe early 30s, that you can start to instill new and better ways of doing things.
Definitely. And I think, I think there are innovative and immersive ways that you can engage these older folks, older audiences. But it's not necessarily going to be to create an experience on spatial, for example, Like, I think there are, and that's why I come back so often to the fundamentals, right? Because, like, you're talking at a target audience that has their specific, reasons and motivations and, like, the things that they like and the things that they would like to do in a corporate event. So, just look at that before you actually decide that you want to create an activation on spatial, right? So I think, for example, for once, AR could be interesting for you to engage with these guys, right? Because it's going to be a novelty, but it's a novelty that they can actually engage with, right? And actually amaze themselves with, rather than just them being in a game, on their laptops, on their work computers, And so...
There's an interesting statistic, and I don't actually remember the exact stat, and I don't have the source in front of me, which I hate. I don't have the budget. I don't have a Jamie to pull it up for me. But there's an uptick in gamer per day hour spent gaming when people are in their 60s and 70s. When people get into retirement, there's a whole category of old gamers. And I think it's under talked about, and we aren't building games for them, and we aren't building experiences for them. And for brands that are so focused on marketing to a younger audience in Roblox, I think that is an interesting opportunity for some of these brands that might have an older demographic that they're looking at, that there actually is an audience there. It's just a very different audience, and they're going to need a different type of experience than the younger generation would. I'm not sure if have you looked into that at all? Because I just found out about this last week.
Yeah, no, actually, yes. There was a research a while ago that said that there's a lot of 60s and 70-year-old folks that are spending a lot of over 8 hours a day on VR. Retired, typically living in a retirement home, that are spending a lot of time on VR because that's the only thing that they can do. And it's actually very fulfilling for them because it brings back this feeling of being free and being able to explore and all of these things. So it makes a lot of sense. Personally, I think that silver economy by itself is it's this whole thing that most companies are not actively exploring. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And if you look up silver surfers on Google, especially within China, you're going to find out that there's a lot of things happening in China for older people, right? Because they have realized that there's a lot of old people that want to consume technology and want to consume products, right? So, and there's a lot of trends going around in China, especially in their TikTok, which is not called TikTok, right? It's called Douyin, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a lot of trends going there. It's called silver surfers, right? Because these older audiences, they want to consume things as well. So I think people from the rest of the world are naturally going to start realizing that, yes, there's a demand for these guys, right? And if you look at the progression of the birth rates and death rates and the progression of age throughout society, you're going to realize that in the near future there's going to be a lot more older people than younger people. So definitely an opportunity there.
Yeah, I think it's huge. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for innovation in it just because it's so underlooked at. I think there's a lot of noise happening on the other side of the spectrum because that's where we see all the data on hundreds of millions of users that are under 20 years old. But these older folks, I was so surprised. I talk to my grandparents all the time. They're in their early 80s, and I admire them so much. I used to occasionally leave high school to go hang out with them and just talk to them about their lives because they're such interesting people. But they're in their 80s and they have a Tesla. They've got an Apple Watch. They've got iPhones, iPads. They love it. They don't know how to use any of it, but they're trying, and it's so cool to see them invested in it. And my grandma listens to the same podcasts I do. I mean, she's listening to Andrew Huberman and trying to hack how to get her brain chemistry working right. And it's they consume content too. They're interested in this stuff too. It's not unique to young people. And I think there's a way to look at it as to okay, there's an opportunity with young people and it's different than the opportunity with older people. But there's still an opportunity. And if you have the right customer base, if you have the incentive as an organization to work with that older demographic, I highly encourage y'all to double down on it.
There's just to wrap it up, I'd like to mention something that I personally have been consuming. There's a trend, a rising trend of old influencers on Twitch. So they play League of Legends, and it's these 60, 70-year-old guys, playing.
That's awesome.
And it's awesome. It really is awesome because it's super like there's this guy here in Brazil that he's like he has the worst temper. Like he plays League of Legends like he's main Yasuo, and like he's pissed off like 99% of the time, and he's cursing everyone, but he's an amazing player, and he really like he does a really good job as Yasuo, right? And so like he's, I think, 60, and he's often like smoking cigarettes and cursing everyone, like, oh, you mother, like, and playing through the game and like just killing everyone, and like, I told you I was the best. And he streams everything on Twitch, and it's super funny, and younger people love it. They absolutely love it. So there's also this like rising trend of like older people doing streams and being influencers just because they're funny, like they're amusing.
Totally. It's a different type of personality. And there's also this whole ADHD kind of tension span movement where folks are even just playing videos of games while listening to information because it helps them focus more. And I know so many people that have very simple games, kind of like Yuga Labs' new heavy metal game, which you're like this little robot and you just build tiles and collect energy. It's very simple. There's really not a lot of crazy innovation to it, but we'll see what they do in the next couple months. But it is interesting because it doesn't take a lot of work. It's not very distracting. And I have a lot of friends that'll open up a separate tab on their computer and they'll just kind of click on it every now and then and build a new tile, wait 20 minutes for that to build. And it actually helps them stay focused on their work and other tasks because every 20 minutes or so, they just go click 3 clicks, watch the robot move around, and then they go back to working. It's almost like this little rest that kind of helps you reset your attention. So that's totally anecdotal. I have no data on that, but I just think it's an interesting kind of trend I'm hearing about. But anyways, I know we're kind of at time. I know you mentioned you have a hard stop coming up. So Eli, I just want to thank you so much for the time. I'd love to run this back at some point. I'm excited to dive deeper into your podcast. But before we hop off, is there anything you'd like to plug? Anywhere people can find you?
Yeah, just follow me on LinkedIn, Ely Santos. I'm very active there. I post every day, and also my podcast, Metavertising. Feel free to take a listen. And if you guys need Metaverse development and consulting, just hit me up on LinkedIn and let's talk. All right?
Hell yeah. We'll throw those links in the description as well. Eli is the man. Go ahead and smash that subscribe button too if you want to hear more of these kind of conversations. And that's the pod.